Sponsored in part by Pediatric Associates of Dallas. Pediatric Associates of Dallas has been providing excellence in pediatric medicine since 1971. PAD has locations in Dallas and Plano and is now open 7 days a week because taking care of kids is what we do.
The following content is not intended as a substitute for professional legal advice, medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your attorney, advocate, physician, or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding any medical or educational concerns.
Hi, and welcome to Empower Dyslexia podcast and show. I'm Rachel Chambers.
I'm Stephen Yearout.
And we're here to make you a better partner in education. On the show, we discuss dyslexia and related disorders, policy at the state and federal level. We speak to experts in the field, and we talk about research, interventions, just about anything dyslexia and related disorders we can find, really. So be sure to subscribe to us on Facebook, like us, or that's what it is, subscribe and like the YouTube channel. On YouTube, we now have, which I just knew about like a week ago, that we have subtitles, and it's also in Spanish. So watch our YouTube shows if you want to have those options available to you. And you can also find us on
all of our favorite apps that we have. You know, obviously, if you're watching this right now, it's either Facebook Live or YouTube Live. iTunes, Google Play, Alexa, Stitcher, Spotify, and now we're on iHeartRadio.
Yeah,
that's something new that I just found out that we made it to iHeartRadio last week.
Yeah, that's pretty
awesome.
exciting.
Yeah,
I know. It's kind of big. So today's show, we have a very special guest, and we're very excited. The topic is basically reading and the reading wars, and there's some a little dyslexia in there too of how that's been used. And we're speaking with Emily Hanford. She is a senior respondent and producer for APM Reports, the documentary and investigative journalism group at American Public Media. She has been covering education for more than a decade. And you can see her work on NPR, the New York Times, Washington Monthly, Los Angeles Times, PBS News Hour, and other publications. I mean, she is out there. Her stuff is... I mean, Stephen and I, before we even started doing the show, we had listened to one of her podcasts, like one of the very first one that had to do with dyslexia and reading. And I was like, oh my gosh, she's amazing. That was a great show.
Her documentary in 2018, I believe, won a Public Service Award.
Wow.
So, I mean, this is, what is it? Hard words. Why aren't kids being taught how to read?
Yeah, right there too. Yep.
Yeah, we got a link right here. So if you'll bring that up.
There it is.
Here's the link to that.
Why aren't kids being taught to read?
That's the million-dollar question.
That is. Why? It's so vital to anybody's survival in first world, second world, well, anywhere really on this planet. You need to learn how to read.
And we'll make sure we have links to all of her reports in the description.
You have to check them out. She is amazing, and I'm so glad. I contacted her and asked her, and Stephen's talked to her too, and will you come on the show? Yes. I was like, oh my gosh, she's going to come on the show. Yay. So also, she just released another documentary. And when we say documentary, it's like a radio podcast documentary. It's really well put together. And it's called At a Loss for Words. How Flawed Ideas is Teaching Millions of Kids to Be Poor Readers, which this one just blew my mind also. And there that one is.
So what's interesting is we had Meet the Teacher yesterday.
Yeah.
And my dyslexic son is in an honors English class, reading class. So I asked, I said, so how do you teach reading?
Well, now that we've listened to this,
Yeah,
it's like, how are you doing? What's the strategy?
How were you taught to teach reading? And she looked at me with kind of a blank look, and she was like, I don't know what you mean. And I named off, the
different methods,
the different methods and programs of thoughts, and she goes, well, I was taught phonics as a child, so I lean more towards the phonics side. But she did admit that there are teachers that she knows that teach the guessing method, that teach the skip it method.
Okay.
So
that's why we wanted to have Emily on the show today,
right?
Because she is given us a wealth of information. So good morning, Emily. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes. You're a bit blurry. Ziggy, do you know about the blur? Can't fix it right now? Okay. Well, hopefully
it'll clear up.
It will clear up with the internet and whatnot. So, okay, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
And why you, what drove you to, I say drove you, what was the interest in reading and dyslexia?
Sure. Well, like you said in the introduction, thank you very much for that generous introduction. I've been an education reporter for more than 10 years, since about 2007, 2008. And most of my work has been focused on secondary and post-secondary education. And specifically, I've been mostly interested in the team that I work with spends a lot of time looking at inequities in education and opportunity in education, and how opportunity is dispersed somewhat unevenly in this country when it comes to educational opportunities and educational success. And we try to investigate that in a variety of ways. And we're also very interested in the question of how people learn and what is being learned about how learning works and how that is being translated into practice. So what happened is that actually I was doing the math about 4 years ago now. I had been working on a project which was about the very large number of students who graduate from high school, go on to college, and end up in what are known as remedial or developmental education classes. And I was looking at this because a lot of people who start in those classes don't end up finishing college. And I came away with two kind of big ahas, two big questions that I wanted to investigate further. One big question was, to what extent are sort of undiagnosed, unremediated, unrecognized learning disabilities a part of what's happening when people are graduating from high school, going to college, and not making it into college level classes? I was interested in that, partly because as I was doing this reporting, I was meeting a number of people who had discovered later in life that they had some sort of learning disability. And as you probably know, the most common kind of learning disability, learning issue is with reading. Like 80-90% of people who have learning problems, they have a reading problem is among the problems they have. Mm-hmm. And so I just got really interested in that question. And like I said, I've been focused on high school and higher education. But what I started to see is that a lot of what's going on there in terms of where people are ending up and how their educational trajectory is, where it's going, a lot of that you can trace back to very early, and particularly when it comes to reading problems. If kids don't get off to a good start in reading, it really, unless there's some kind of good intervention that happens along the way, and then too often there's not, it really doesn't turn out well for a lot of kids. And a lot of people can really kind of, if you're not off to a good start in reading in like first and second grade, it can be really hard to make up for that. You fall further and further behind. So that was really how I got interested initially in dyslexia. Part of it was that I did an extraordinary interview with a young woman who had ended up in a remedial education English class in college. And I didn't really know anything about dyslexia. I don't have personal experience with it. It's not something that I knew anything about. And I sat with her one afternoon and we talked for hours. And she just explained to me dyslexia. It's not something she knew. She wasn't diagnosed with that. She didn't get any particular help with that when she was in elementary school. It's something she discovered later in life. But it was just so fascinating to me to talk to her and to recognize all of the different kinds of strategies and coping mechanisms that she'd come up with to be able to succeed in school without really being able to read the words very well on the page. That was really interesting to me. And so I just started getting interested in learning disabilities generally, in dyslexia in particular. And this led me to do a documentary a few years ago that you mentioned called Hard to Read, which is specifically about dyslexia and the problems that many families have getting schools to identify a kid's problems with reading and know what to do to do anything about it, or even if they do acknowledge and want to do something about it, to do something that's really helpful, that's something that's effective. And that led me more, and the question really is why? Why are many schools reluctant to use that label and that word and to identify kids with reading problems? And why is it that so many parents still have a problem feeling like their kid is getting the right kind of help, even if they do get identified and get special education services? And that led me to this much larger question about reading in general, like reading instruction writ large. Like how are children being taught to read? The number of kids that we have in this country who have dyslexia is partly that we are not teaching a lot of kids right from the get-go how to read well. And a lot of those kids may not, quote unquote, have dyslexia or need that label or need special education if they had been taught differently right from the beginning. So it just led me to the fact that there is a huge amount known about how people learn to read, what skilled reading is, what the human brain has to do to be able to read those little squiggly lines on the page. Tremendous amount of research over the past 40, 50 years that's mostly coming out of the cognitive scientists and psychology. And that a lot of this work isn't making its way into schools. My question, I really wanted to know more about what that research was and why it's not making its way into schools.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, why? Because
we ask it all the time.
And you went down that road and and everybody let you ask that question why, and you interviewed the people and got the answers and shared them with the rest of us. So that's pretty cool. For me, it's like, aha.
I don't understand why, if we look to the cognitive scientists, the medical professionals that have studied this 9 different ways from Sunday,
like
and
the real
they
science.
they know what it is and how to remediate it. Mm-hmm. But yet you don't do it in school. Mm-hmm. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me.
Right. No. So in your latest podcast, the one At a Loss for Words, What's Wrong with How Schools Teach Reading, can you explain the differences? And I mean, that podcast goes into it, but can you explain briefly the differences between phonics, whole word, and balanced literacy? Because I'd just like to do a quick review for our listeners who haven't, listened to your podcast, so they get what we're talking about later.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, this is what's become really interesting to me as a reporter, is to delve into the history of sort of where reading and ideas about how reading works and the kind of reading instruction going on in schools, like where that comes from. And here's the deal. We've been arguing about how kids learn to read and how they should be taught for a very, very long time. You can trace it back a way long time, but just talking about the United States of America, we basically have been fighting about it since we founded this country and we set up public schools hundreds of years ago. And the truth is that no one really knew that much about how people actually learn to read. It was a little bit mysterious. We didn't have the research that helps us really understand what's going on in someone's brain when they're reading words. That research hasn't come till more recently. So we were fighting about a lot of this stuff without a whole lot of, with sort of limited evidence. It just sort of teaching kids certain ways and then looking to see what seemed to be most effective. And there's some good research that's been done earlier in the 20th century that looked at that. But basically, the fight has really been between phonics and a whole word approach. That's the way it was for a really long time. Like, you can trace this fight back to the 1800s in the United States of America.
Wow. And
essentially, the phonics approach is the idea that the English language is a morphophonemic language, basically, but it's essentially that words in English are made up of individual letters and combinations of letters that represent speech sounds, and that kids need to learn the ways that sounds and letters correspond first to be able to build up to reading whole words. That was one approach. And then another approach was whole word, is that eventually, like at the end of the day, it seems like when you become a good reader, it seems like you're just reading whole words. So the idea is, why don't we start kids there? Let's start with the whole word method. Getting into these little letters and sounds is confusing. There's a lot of arguments that made it harder for kids, more tedious, boring. So there was really kind of a knockdown, very emotional fight between these two things, whether you basically teach kids to read whole words. And the assumption behind that is that learning to read is basically a visual memory process, that you associate the look of words with the meaning of words, and eventually you associate those two things together, or somehow you figure out how the sounds and letters work just through kind of dealing with words at the whole word level first, versus this idea that it's a discrete series of sort of knowledge and skills about letters and sounds, and that builds up to accomplish reading. So that was really the fight for a long time. And then in the 1960s, 70s, a newish idea, I mean, no idea is totally new. It was based on a lot of things that were around for a long time, but there was this thing called whole language, which is not the same as whole words. Some people think those things are the same. I think I understood initially those two things to be the same, but it's really a little bit different. And this most recent documentary that I did tried to investigate the kind of beliefs about how reading works that are behind whole language. So the general idea in whole language is that learning to read is essentially a natural process. It's not something you need to teach kids explicitly, but through being absorbed in books, exposed to books, that eventually human beings will figure out how reading works. That's kind of the basic idea, and that's not doing it full justice, but that's kind of the basic idea.
Well, yeah, like they look at the beginning, the first letter of the word, then you look at the picture, like the butterfly, the bee, butterfly. Oh, it's got to be butterfly, without actually sounding any of it out. I mean, they're taking other cues, and what's the rest of the sentence say? They're not really reading, but it appears like they are reading. Is that right? Is that somewhat of an explanation, Emily?
When I was trying to read Lord of the Rings, there were no pictures.
Right. Well, that's the thing. The breakdown is at 3rd, 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th, and on up. There's not many pictures to get any cues from, visual cues. So
well,
what do you do
you
then?
guys are talking about the cueing theory. So this is what I've been investigating most recently. Like, what's kind of the theory of how reading works that's at the core of the whole language movement? Because it really was a movement that took hold pretty strongly in American schools by the 1980s. And one of the kind of core ideas there is this thing called the cueing system. The idea that when a skilled reader is reading words, they're not actually paying that much attention to the letters and the sounds. Once you're a skilled reader, you're not dealing with the letters and sounds. You're really more like skimming and using your knowledge of language structure and vocabulary, that you're mostly using context to read. That as you're a skilled reader and reading along, you're really predicting what the words are going to be, and that's how you're reading. Essentially, you're not sort of dealing with them at the level of the letters. That was the kind of a theory, and it turned into this idea that the way you would then teach reading is, if that's the way skilled reading works, what you want to do then is teach kids to do that, because the kind of one of the ideas that's turns out to be fairly flawed that the cognitive scientists have figured out is that the way you become expert at something is you sort of mimic what it looks like experts do. And it looks like what experts do is they read whole words. So you teach kids to read whole words, and then this whole language idea comes along that it's not about memorizing the words. It's about using context and your knowledge of language to predict the words as you go. So this is an idea that you will now find all over reading curriculum in the United States and all over teaching practices. You will also find phonics instruction in most schools. So in most schools, kids are going to be taught phonics. Now, whether they're being taught that, whether they are being taught that well, whether the teachers themselves have enough training in the way the English language works and the written English language system, which is complicated, whether they have the knowledge to teach phonics well, whether they have materials to do it well, whether they understand why phonics is so important, whether they do enough of it, whether they understand how to differentiate that instruction so that kids who really need a higher dose of it and are at a lower level get more and other kids aren't. Like, there's a lot of questions to be asked about the phonics instruction going on in schools today. But there is some kind of phonics instruction in most schools, right? Or some kind of word work. But what you'll also typically find is this 3 cueing theory, this idea that you want to teach kids lots of different strategies when they don't know a word. So you also teach them to look at the picture, look at the first letter, look at the context, check, go skip the word, go back and check. The idea is that these are the things that skilled readers are doing. But what the cognitive sciences showed, which is the big aha, and the message has not made its way into education very well, is that is not what skilled readers are doing.
Right.
That's
so what
less skilled readers do.
Right. That's what I was like so taken aback by, because the cueing, the 3 cueing is basically how, I mean, for me, I don't know about for Stephen or any other dyslexic for that matter, but we look at, like, I would read the questions at the end of the, whatever you call that paragraph, to see what they wanted from me and then go back. And so I'd have some kind of context because I couldn't comprehend. And so basically what I'm trying to say is that it seems like to me that they were teaching kids how to survive reading, how dyslexics survive reading without sounding it out. To me,
there's a lot of assumption.
And
in these theories, there's a lot of assumption that there is a good foundation to do these styles of reading, right? Mm-hmm. There's an assumption that the foundation is there, therefore we can move on. Mm-hmm. But what we've found is that foundation has never been laid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We actually
I think
have
it's also really important, like even what you just brought up, the strategy of going to the comprehension questions at the end, right?
Yeah,
reading those first
that was my strategy,
further.
Like in third, fourth, or not third, fourth, but like fifth and through all the way through ACT testing.
So that was my strategy
and
last
one
week.
thing to establish that's important is that's not necessarily a bad strategy. Like that's actually not necessarily a bad strategy if you're in terms of reading comprehension. Like you might actually want to teach kids to do that. The question here is whether you're doing that because you have a hard time at the level of the words. You don't know what the words are. So what you're like that can be a reading comprehension strategy. But one of the things that's happened in terms of the understanding of reading within education is we have kind of intertwined reading comprehension, which is the goal of reading. No one disputes the idea that at the end of the day, the purpose of teaching kids about how to read words and teaching reading is so that you can read something and comprehend it. But we have kind of that is so important that we've kind of like lost a little bit of the goal of like how you get there. Mm-hmm. Like, yes, that is the goal, but you cannot be, and this is what the cognitive science research shows very clearly, without having good skills at the level of the word, knowing the words automatically, and we can talk about how that happens in a minute because no one understood that. So it is true that when you're a skilled reader, it looks like you're just reading whole words, like you just know the word instantly, mm-hmm. and you do. But you haven't memorized that when you're a skilled reader, it's not because you've memorized it, a visual thing, and I'll get back to that in a moment. But it's really important to understand that in order to comprehend what you read, you need good word level skills. You need to have a big bank of lots and lots of words that you know. And if you are a skilled reader, and I'm lucky, I happen to be one, and I'm one of those brains, and again, there's a continuum that is distributed among human beings in terms of their brain's ability to get this whole reading thing. I happen, I think, to be born with a brain that is good at this and didn't need a whole lot of instruction. I'm a very skilled reader. I know, as the cognitive science shows, tens of thousands of words instantly on sight. Well, you just flash that word in front of me and I know it right away.
And your documentary said this, that 40% of everybody will learn how to read regardless of any instruction, regardless of they're going to learn to read regardless if they're taught, but they're just going to get it eventually.
To distinguish this, so there's some percentage of kids, maybe it's about 40 or 50%, depending on where you are, a particular school, it could be much higher or much lower than that. Mm-hmm. There's some percentage of kids that are going to figure out reading. It's not because it's natural and it just happens automatically, but there's some combination of teaching they got from a teacher or a parent or something, or a television show like Sesame Street, right? Where something has happened, something has begun to click where they start to understand this whole way that words work, right? And they get it, and they get it easily, and then they start to teach themselves how to read through reading. But some kids don't get that start, and really, really need explicit instruction to get that beginning, and maybe need a lot of explicit instruction on the way to keep them going. And one of the other things that the research shows really clearly is that good instruction in how the written language works, which is one of the ways that I like to talk about it rather than talking about phonics, pure phonics, because not all phonics phonics isn't enough to learn how to read. Not all phonics programs are good. And the English language is a complex language. It is not just based on sounds. We have what I said before, a morphophonemic language. So our language is this beautiful melting pot that comes from different languages all over the world. So English spelling can seem kind of wacky. Like, why is that spelled that way and that spelled this way? And it's the same letters and combinations of letters in those words, right? Well, you have to have an understanding of the history of the English language and where those came from. Is that a Greek word, a Latin word? It could be coming from French, from German, Anglo-Saxon. So we have a complex spelling system in the English language. So you really have to think about how you teach children how their written language works. So when human beings are born, unless you have a cognitive deficit or a hearing problem, you are going to learn how to talk and how to understand the language that surrounds you. But the written language is something we invented as human beings a long time ago. And you're not necessarily just going to figure that out through immersion, the way that you do spoken language. And so you need to learn it. Some people need to be taught it more than others, but it's this thing that you need to learn. And yeah, there's a percentage of kids who are going to learn to read pretty well, basically no matter how you teach them. But there's another percentage of kids, and it's a half or maybe more, who aren't going to learn to read much at all at the extreme, or very well, or they're going to not have very good spelling, and they're not going to be able to read very quickly because they don't have a lot of words like stored in their memory through this process called orthographic mapping, which we can return to, unless schools really get it right at those early stages, are really teaching kids explicitly and systematically how to read words when they're in kindergarten, first and second grade.
Ziggy, you said there was a question?
Yes. So we have a question on the chat here, and I think that this is an appropriate time for it. We have someone who's wanting to know if one of the problems here is that a lot of the interventions are not required to only use programs tested and proven by evidence-based research.
Certainly, that's part of it. I mean, I think part of the issue, one of the things that I have been trying to get at as a reporter is a little bit away from programs and more into the question of how people learn to read and whether the things that are being done in schools, whether it's a program, other kinds of approaches that are being used, are actually informed by that. There are some programs out there that have some research that show they work. And when you look at them, they're not actually based very solidly on what we know about how people learn how to read. And one of the reasons some of those things may work is that there are some kids who are going to learn no matter what. And there are some kids who, through like a certain amount of intensive, even if it's not really well grounded in the science of how reading works, a lot of intensive exposure, you're going to throw a lot of different things at them and they're going to start to figure it out, right? So you can see effects in some programs that may not be like solidly based on evidence, but you do bring up a really good point, which is we also don't know, there's a lot of programs that are being used out there that really don't have much evidence at all behind them. And so we really need to be rigorous and ask, what is the evidence behind this? But I guess my caution is there are some programs that have some evidence behind them that I would still be cautious of.
Right.
Well, we need to-
Because it's not real science. It's kind of like, well, this is what worked in these 3 classrooms.
Right, we
which
need
is
to
not
ask-
a large body of students
You
or subjects.
You need to ask, number one, where was the research done?
Who paid for it?
what-
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to bump
What
the
was
table.
the research, and really dive into it, right? I don't want somebody else's research and then you just took it and kind of massaged the data. I want to know what you've done and what evidence you have. And you can't just do, like you said, a small set and go, okay, well, it's now evidence.
Right. That's not real research. You don't have any double blinds, triple blinds. You don't have 1,000 to 2,000 to 5,000 subjects. I mean, if you have a classroom or 2 or 3 and say, oh, well, 60% did pretty good, or maybe 80% did pretty good.
Well, you and I talked about this the other
That's
day.
not real research.
We as the general public, the parents, don't really understand a lot of what it means to have research. And even if somebody put research in front of you, you may not understand what that research really means.
It's in depth because there's
Right.
like all these scores.
Right. So we need
A lot
to
of
make sure that we
statistics.
understand it.
Yeah.
Especially for our kids that have learning disabilities.
For
So,
sure. So
I think one of the other things too that's going on is that our expectations are fairly low in this country. Like we have a really large number of kids who aren't even reading on a basic level. And even some of the research that you can find that is done, randomized controlled trials and large numbers of students, can show effects, can look like good research when 60 or 70% of the kids do well. But other research shows that it should be much higher than that. Like a good reading program should be working for the vast majority of kids,
Correct.
95% of kids.
Right.
And there are researchers who have shown this. So it's not like there. But the other thing I think that's really important for schools and parents to recognize is that I think it's a fool's game to sort of be in search of the perfect program. We have a larger issue here, which is just the general understanding of how skilled reading works, what is going on when kids struggle, and what needs to be done about that. Because I think just handing teachers programs, good, well-informed programs, teachers have told me they learn about how reading works from good programs. But you can also hand a program to a teacher and they don't really understand why they're doing it. You know what I mean? Like we fight so much about phonics in this country, and I understand the fight because there's a lot of not very good phonics instruction that's happened over time. There is a sense, and sometimes it is dry or boring or tedious or lots of worksheets. And two things to say about that. It doesn't need to be dry, boring, and tedious and lots of worksheets. And dry, tedious, and boring in some worksheets can actually help kids learn to read,
Right.
which can then get them off to like kind of learning that's not dry, tedious, boring worksheets. But I think we fought about phonics because of the way phonics has been taught, some misguided educators who have thought that that's all you need to do, right? That it's just phonics. Although I really don't know anyone responsible in the world of reading who like thinks that you only teach phonics, and that's a charge that's often put against phonics people. But I think one of the reasons we fight so much about phonics is because there's not much of an understanding of what it is about phonology, about sound, about understanding the ways that sounds work in words that's so critical to being a good reader. And I've been trying as a reporter to help people understand, why does phonics matter so much? Because for the most part, all skilled readers have good phonics skills. There are always some exceptions to everything, right? But phonics skills are a crucial component to skilled reading. And so if you need good phonics skills to be a good reader for the most part, why wouldn't we teach those skills to kids? Got to figure out good, effective ways to do it. We've got to understand that that's only part of the equation when it comes to reading. But the other thing we need to realize is that the reason that phonics is so important is, I've mentioned a couple of times this term orthographic mapping. This is what people did not understand for a very long time, which is, how does skilled reading really work? When you can whip through text and you just know how are you doing that? And it turns out that phonics skills are very important in that process. That the way that I know tens of thousands of words instantly on sight, I know the word quicker, I know the word chair quicker than I process a picture of a chair. Okay, that's an example I use in the documentary. How did I learn to do that? Well, it turns out that phonics skills are key to that. That it's because, and I can't tell you all the rules of phonics, and I don't need to tell you all the rules of phonics, but it's because I have an understanding of the ways that letters and combinations of letters represent sound in the English language. I successfully sounded out all those words that I know. At some point, I successfully sounded them out. I connected the pronunciation of the word with the meaning and the spelling of the word. When your brain does that, you connect the pronunciation, the spelling, and the meaning together. A typically developing reader who's got some good phonics skills encounters a word, has never seen it before in print, looks at it, takes a whack at sounding it out, tries to figure out if that's a word that they know the meaning of. If it's a word they know the meaning of, they're like, oh yeah, that says floss. I know floss. And then they've connected the meaning, the pronunciation, and the spelling. If it's a word they don't know the meaning of, they can use context to try to figure out the meaning. But once you've attached the pronunciation, spelling, and a meaning of a word in your brain, you've successfully sounded it out a few times. It's there for your forever. Like, you can't suppress my ability to read a word that I've orthographically mapped to my memory. I don't know if I've explained that well enough.
So to me, that's visual memory for me. That's
right.
That's what that is. And that's how I learned to read, was memorizing words. It was not by sounding it out.
But this is the key difference that cognitive scientists have recognized. So you can visually memorize, and if you're like an intelligent person with a good memory or whatever, like you can memorize thousands of words. But you can't really memorize by the look of them the tens of thousands of words that really marks a skilled reader from a less skilled reader. The way that a skilled reader knows those words instantly is not the way the words look. It's the fact that that particular sequence of letters and sounds is so familiar to them, and they've come across it enough times that they know it. So it's a really hard thing to understand. But it's not really like, I don't know a word because I've memorized it a visual image. I know it because at some point I successfully sounded it out. And a lot of very highly functioning people with dyslexia have this bank of words that they know basically because they've seen them a lot of times. They're familiar to them. But they don't have as big of a bank of sort of what scientists call sight words, which is these things that you orthographically map to your memory. So when you have dyslexia, you've got two challenges before you. Number one, your bank of known words or sight words are smaller than a lot of people who are skilled readers. So it's just a little bit slower for you. Like there's a lot of words that maybe you're not going to recognize or whatever. And then you come across words you don't know, and you probably don't have quite the same skills to sound it out. That's what you just said, Stephen, right? Like if you come across a word you've never seen before, what do you do? What do you do?
I try to sound it out.
You try. And then where does that get you?
Sometimes I can do it, and sometimes I can't. I mean, right. And then I try to figure out, does that word that I'm trying to sound out, does that actually, is it going to change what I'm reading?
Right.
And then I do these.
Right? Try to figure out, does that make sense?
Then I skip the word if I don't know what it is.
And go on to the rest of the sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah, like the 3Q method, basically.
Well, and again, so you go back to that and you go, well, that's not really reading.
Well, it
is reading, but it's just taking a long way to get there.
But we also know that one word can change
the whole sentence,
the entire meaning of that sentence.
Yeah.
And if it's that one word, I'm not going to understand what I was supposed to get out of that text.
Yeah.
I mean, studies show that even very highly skilled readers, when they're forced to predict words or guess words from context, they're only right a smallish percentage of the time, 25, 30, 35% of the time. So just think about that for a minute. Yes, you probably, and there are just like, there's a smallish number of English words, which are the words we mostly see, right? So this is why people with dyslexia who have good memories can get through text, right? There's a certain number of words that you know, and those are the most frequently used words in the English language, the ones that you've seen a lot, right? So you can get through it using these strategies, like using the context, skipping the words you don't know. But you're probably going to be inaccurate and not know it all the time, right? You're going at it much slower, which makes the whole thing a more laborious task. I mean, many people with dyslexia tell me, like, I can get through text, but it takes me forever, and my head hurts. And by the end, I don't want to see another word. I just want to I'm done. I read that. I don't want to read anymore.
And the joy of reading is there's not a joy of reading if it's so laborious,
Well, it goes back to what we were talking about, the comprehension questions.
Right.
That's why dyslexics go to the questions first and read it, because I don't want to have to read all of the nonsense that I don't need. I'm trying to get to the answer.
Yeah.
And that's been part of our biggest problem, is we try to teach to the answer, not how to solve the problem.
Yeah, and comprehend what you're reading so you can answer the questions without necessarily going back and forth. I'm going to skip to another question real quick. So in your documentary, the latest one, you interviewed Ken Goodman. And his wife, I believe. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That was a 4-hour interview, you said.
Yes. Well, Ken Goodman is one of the people who's considered one of the founders of the whole language movement, not the only one. And he kind of put forth an early version of this queuing system idea back in 1967. Many other people have contributed to that work. He's not the only one. But he put it out in a paper in 1967. And there are some people in other parts of the world who kind of came up with this idea sort of independently, very similar ideas that we use queues to read words. But essentially, this really has become a foundational idea in reading instruction. And what's interesting is that those ideas about cueing were intriguing to cognitive scientists at first. There were many cognitive scientists who thought that made complete sense, that the ideas that Ken Goodman put out seemed reasonable. And they went into labs and they tested this idea, and they found out that really the opposite was true. Like what the sort of one of the big takeaways from the cognitive science research is that the hallmark of a skilled reader is someone who does not rely on context to read words. And the hallmark of struggling readers is that they rely on context to read words. So it's not that you can't, as many of you know, there are many highly functioning dyslexics who have figured out unbelievable ways to get through text and to read things. But like we just said, it's laborious and difficult. And what's happening though is because this idea that we use cues to read words took hold back in the 1970s and 80s in education, and we fought about it as this fight between whole language and phonics. Even as there has been more of an acceptance of phonics, because so much research shows that it is so critical, phonology and the way that sounds work in words is such a critical component of learning how to read. Even as people have more accepted that and are trying to do it and trying to do better, and lots of schools are adding in phonics programs, and maybe really good phonics programs, and giving their teachers training in that. Many of them are also keeping the 3 cueing system in place, and they don't realize that there's a conflict there, that the cueing system and the phonics idea really represent different ideas about how the reading process works and what are the things that lead to skilled reading. What needs to be in place? What do you want to teach kids in school so that they are skilled readers by the time they get to 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, so that they become skilled adults? And you don't want to teach cueing. Cueing is the thing that you do when you can't read the words very well.
Right.
We shouldn't be teaching that
That's
to
a
kids.
coping mechanism. Those are coping mechanism. I mean, in my mind, it's a dyslexic's way of coping with not being able to sound out and read the words automatically like their peers.
Right. And it's a very important thing for people to understand. I mean, it's very tricky to talk about this, because the whole idea of using context to read words, skilled readers use context all the time. I mean, you use context to understand what you're reading, absolutely. But the difference is, do you immediately know the words? Are there lots and lots of words that you just immediately know as soon as you see them? That's the hallmark of being a skilled reader. And we want to give kids what they need, but put the pieces in place so that they too get there. So that they become the person who just instantly knows lots of words and doesn't have to go to the end of the reading comprehension and look at the questions because they want to go back and not read the words. They want to go back and just find the words with the answers to the questions. It's a great strategy before you do reading comprehension, even if you're a good reader, to go look at the questions and think, these are the things I want to be focusing on when I'm reading, but not because you can't, because you struggle and it's laborious and hard for you to get through the text.
Correct. Yeah.
You want to do that because you're like, well, that's a good comprehension strategy. But this goes back to what I said before, which is we've intertwined the idea of comprehension and decoding so much in early reading instruction, and we so much want kids to comprehend what they read, which we absolutely do, that we start focusing on that right away when kids are 5 or 6 years old, without recognizing that comprehension is a product, partly, of your ability to decode words really well.
So I asked
your vocabulary, like what are the words you know the meaning of in your oral vocabulary?
So I ask that question all the time. When it comes to testing, I ask them, are you testing my child's ability to read, or are you testing his ability to comprehend? 2 totally different things.
Yeah, totally different.
I mean, the thing is, they're not totally different things, but we do mostly measure kids' ability to comprehend. And there's a lot of things that go into reading comprehension, and there are important things that schools need to be thinking about. But reading comprehension really is your ability to decode the words, but also like all the vocabulary, you know, the people that talk to you, and your background knowledge, right? So this is one of the things that I try to lay out so clearly in the documentary that I just did. What you want to see in an elementary school classroom is a focus on decoding and phonics and explicitly teaching kids how their written language works, of which phonics is part, but there's more to it. So you want to see that. Then you want to develop the kids' oral vocabulary way beyond words that they could possibly read when they're 5 or 6 years old, but you want them to know the meaning of lots of words. And you want to build their knowledge, just their knowledge of the world. Because what you find when kids take tests, even kids who don't have very good decoding skills, right, could read a passage about something that they know a lot about. They have good background knowledge, and they will be able to comprehend that much better than something they don't know much about. And so that is important, and people will point to that and say, see, decoding the words isn't important, right? But it is important. It's just, yes, they are getting through and using a lot of context and stuff because they have a lot of that good background knowledge. But what is the way that people develop knowledge? Reading.
Through reading.
Well,
You read to learn.
Yeah. You read to learn. I mean, there are other
Yep.
ways you can learn, but that is the primary way that children are learning new words and learning new knowledge by about second or third grade. You want to get kids there so that they can develop their knowledge, because it's a self-affirming cycle, right? It's a
totally.
virtuous cycle. And it's the opposite. When kids don't get off to a good start in reading, it becomes the opposite of a virtuous cycle, and they don't gain the knowledge and vocabulary, so their reading comprehension further suffers. So there are all these like pieces that need to be in place, and good knowledge of how to read words at the word level and decode words is just an incredibly important part of that. The problem with 3Qing is that it actually teaches kids the opposite. It teaches kids they don't have to sound out words.
Right.
They have other ways that they can figure out the words. And yes, there are other ways to figure out the words. It just turns out that they're not very efficient.
Right.
They're not very reliable.
It's teaching them to be poor readers, not
Yeah.
skilled readers, and we want America to be great, right? We want the majority of, well, if not all, if we could get everybody to read and be skilled readers, that would be great. So during your investigative reporting, what in finding out all the stuff that you have learned, what kind of changes do you think need to be made to get us to where America, or even the world, but like here, how we can get everybody to start really reading? Like how we can get our reading scores back up from 30%, 40%, which that's not teaching kids to read if we're at 30-40% reading rate.
Yeah, when you look at the scores, when you look at like 40% proficient, then you realize, well, 40% of kids are going to learn to read and about how to
Right, they're not teaching them.
So, well, there's something wrong with the way that we're teaching
Well,
them.
I flipped that. So you say 40%, 60% aren't reading.
That's exactly. It's like, how do we get the other 60% that don't need instruction? Or no, I'm sorry, the 40% don't really need that much of instruction, but the rest of us, because we are not born with an innate ability to just read. We have to be taught. So what do you think? What changes could be made and maybe should be made and get us going in the right direction?
Well, I think the biggest problem is that just this knowledge of what the cognitive scientists have learned about reading just hasn't made its way into education or into schools of education. So I think that's the primary problem. And there's really just a lot of resistance and a lot of fighting. And I think most teachers out there they're not really interested in this fight. They actually want to teach kids how to read, but a lot of them just don't know. They just don't know that there's all this science that's been done. They don't know that there's all this stuff that they could be doing. And that's really tragic. So it needs to be at both levels. It needs to be in the schools of education so that before people get into the classroom, they're learning this, and the professors in the schools of education know this themselves, and many of them don't. And then we need to work on the many, many teachers that are in schools today with professional development. But I think one of the reasons I did the piece I just did is it's not enough to teach teachers how to teach phonics, because number one, phonics isn't enough. But number two, we've got to get rid of ideas about reading that are wrong, that are not the way that people become skilled readers. And until we get rid of those ideas, I don't think we're going to get that far. But I think the only way you really get rid of those ideas is by helping teachers understand, how does reading work?
Right,
Like,
the science.
how does it work, and what is going on when kids are struggling? If teachers could really be introduced to all that research, I think it would make a very big difference, because I think then they themselves could see some of the things that they're doing are like, wait, why am I doing this? Or they could look at some things in the curriculum that they're handed and say, why do I teach kids to do this? That
Right.
doesn't line up with
what's
what
the
I've learned about how to
rationale?
learn to read.
I mean, that in nursing, we have, what we're supposed to do. And then after the reason, the rationale, this is why we do it. It's backed up by blah, 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 blah research. And we're like, oh, well, that makes us feel very confident that we are going down the right road for this patient, and medicine's the same way. You have to be steered by research and like not publishing, not people that are making money off of.
I mean, I think the important thing to recognize is there's a lot of research out there, and a lot of people can point you to research to back up the things that they believe. And, so again, it's getting back to looking at what is the research and how was it done, and does it line up with what we know just about how reading works. So it's really kind of the Wild West out there and really complicated. And a lot of people who are doing things that don't line up with the cognitive science research have other research that they'll tell you this is why this is right. And I think it's just that we've had just a big divide. Like there's been a lot of research happening in schools of education and sort of literacy research, and then there's been cognitive science research. And I'm not saying the cognitive scientists have all the answers or know how to teach kids to read, but I think a lot of teachers don't know that there's this huge body of evidence within cognitive science. And so we really need to help teachers understand that.
I agree.
And recognize that, everyone says their stuff is backed by research. So even as a parent, if you go in and say, what's the research behind this? Someone's probably going to be able to give you an answer. And then it becomes a much more complicated question, like, how do I really dig into whether this research is high quality? And it's not easy. I wrote a piece which sort of tries to address some of these questions, like what do you do as a parent when you don't think that your kid's school is teaching reading right? And I have a piece that has some answers to that question, but there's no easy answers.
There isn't.
Well, the easy answer is always asking why. How is this addressing what's going on with my child, and does it provide the best support for my child? I ask that question all the time, and even being a dyslexic and having problems or slow reader, I'll sit and read through everything that you give me, and because I'm reading it slower, I'm going to catch a lot of stuff, and then I'm going to come back and start asking a bunch of questions. But you got to educate yourself on what it is and why it is, so you can have those conversations.
Right.
I think one of the things to remember is that we shouldn't have nearly as many struggling readers as we do. Sure, there's a distribution. Some people are going to be better than others. Are we going to be able to get like 100% of kids to be proficient readers as defined by NAEP? No, that's not going to happen. But we have good research out there that shows that we should be able to get 95% of kids reading basically well. They should be able to like decode words, sound out words, map those words to their memory. They may not be like really kick-ass readers at the end of the day, but they should. But if you have a kid who's struggling in school, unless they have like a severe dyslexia, a severe phonological issue, they should be able to learn how to read pretty well. And
I agree.
Should we should be teaching most kids how to read pretty well. We should have 95% kids basic on NAEP. I think it would be fair to say.
That's a great goal.
We have nowhere close to that.
Nowhere close. So
what are we at? 64%, or
I think it's
64% aren't
Right.
proficient.
right. It's
is
pathetic.
Is
Pathetic.
so
Pathetic. So what are you going to be working on next?
Well, I'm hoping that there's a lot. I have many more questions about this reading thing, but like I said, I cover a lot of different topics, so I don't know if I'm going to be allowed to keep going on this reading thing for years to come. But I have plenty of other things I'd like to look at. I really would like to return to the long-term impacts, where I kind of started with this, which is if you don't learn how to read when you're in kindergarten, first and second grade, what happens? What are the trajectories for kids who aren't learning how to read, who aren't being taught how to read? How is that showing up? What kind of an impact is that having on people individually, personally, on our society, people who end up in prison, so much of that. And then I think it's also just so important. One of the things I've come away as a reporter is to recognize that so many schools are not teaching kids very well how to read. But if you come from a family with means of some kind, you're probably going to get some kind of help to be able to not be, to figure out something about how reading works, right? Your parents are going to hire a tutor, or maybe they're going to hire a lawyer. And this is a great emotional and financial cost to many families. We shouldn't be asking families with kids in public schools to do this. But kids from affluent families often have some kind of way out of this if their schools aren't teaching reading well. But other kids don't. And we're just leaving, a lot of their parents don't even realize that they have a reading problem, that they should be able to read much better than they are. And that is a real travesty and a real tragedy.
Sad. It's very sad. So yes, I want to see that. I want you to do a documentary on that. So ask your people to say that Rachel said and Stephen said yes. Yes, please let Emily do that.
As I said yesterday on the phone, your documentary will be writing about my life.
Right. Stephen, is prime example of that, unfortunately. But
Yep.
he's getting skilled now, so
That's right.
we're gonna continue to see improvements there, I think.
Well, Emily, we appreciate all that you do and the great work that you've done in this area. Please keep up the good work, and thank you so much for coming on our show. And hopefully, we can have you back on soon.
Yeah, with your
Yeah,
next
you're welcome.
piece, hopefully.
Thank you.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye bye.
Okay, guys, as we always like to say, if you think something's wrong with your child and they're struggling in school, please go figure out why. We have templates on our website, which is www.empowerdyslexia.info. There's like 4 or 5 of the letter templates that you can just fill it out, put your kid's name in the slot, and then turn them into your school counselor to get the ball rolling. But it doesn't stop there. Once they are identified with whatever it is and a full evaluation covers, then they need the intervention. So it's a process. But start the process. You'll be glad you did. And next week there's our templates. I guess we have 6 of them. Next week we have another great guest, Dr. Heather Stevens, who is a diagnostician, and she's going to go over what's included in a full individual evaluation, which should be fascinating. So tune in next week. I hope you enjoyed our show today. I sure did.
See you then.